Trials normally slow down when they get towards the end, but this is no normal trial. I'm Michael O'Toole. Welcome to another episode of the Star's Shattered Lives podcast, focusing on the trial of Gerry the Monk Hutch. He is charged with the murder of David Byrne at the Regency Airport Hotel on the 5th of February 2016. His co-accused, Jason Bonney and Paul Murphy, are charged with facilitating the murder of Mr. Byrne by providing cars for the gang. Neither is charged with murder. All three deny the charges and are on trial at the non-jury special criminal court, a trial which is approaching its end now. Today was a very busy day in court, so let's get down to business. Star Chief Reporter Paul Healy joins me now to discuss the day's evidence.
Yeah, how's it going?
You had one of your busier days today.
Yeah, it was a really incredible day today. Today we finally got into the closing speeches, so there was a hell of a lot of information. And the listeners might forgive me, I'm literally just back from the court. So it's all fresh in my brain, but I'm also equally exhausted, but I will do my best.
And as ever, you guys didn't get any indication. It was just boom, and there it was. There was no, you weren't given any advance warning, really. It doesn't happen like that.
No, I mean, I suppose, look, we had an idea that it was coming, but we didn't really know when. There was a lot of, which we'll come to if we have time, equally interesting stuff in relation to Jason Bonney and witnesses in relation to that. So that took up there was a lot there that took up quite a bit of the day. And then it was coming up to about 12 o'clock, it was 12:15 really, by the time that Fiona Murphy, senior counsel for the prosecution, was in a position to give her closing speech, and she'd actually said to the judges, look, I can do this after lunch because it's going to be over an hour in length, and Miss Justice Tara Burns told her just basically to press on and go ahead. So, I mean, my head was already wrecked, I'll be honest, in terms of, there was a lot of information to digest from the witness we just heard from, who effectively contradicted much of the alibi witness stuff in relation to Jason Bonney. That was huge stuff. We'll come back to that because I think it's worth discussing that if we have time afterwards. But that took up a portion of the day, and then we were straight into this closing speech from the prosecution.
Okay, so let's, as you say, I think it is important that we'll come back to that direct evidence about Jason Bonney. But let's talk about Miss Murphy's closing speech. One of the questions I was going to ask was, how long did it last? Because closing statements can last quite a long time. So it was about an hour, was it?
It was about an hour in length, whereas Brendan Grehan's argument following her later in the afternoon was over 2 hours in length. So that's the difference there. A couple of things that is worth talking about, just on the outset, that's an observation really. It's not a opinion necessarily, just an interesting observation. We had two closing speeches today, so from prosecuting counsel Fiona Murphy and then from Brendan Grehan afterwards, and the difference between the two of them really was that in my perspective, from what I've seen, that Fiona Murphy read out a statement. She had kind of a prepared statement that she read from, and she kept to that that particular read out statement, prepared statement, whereas Mr. Grehan was a little more freelance, had written notes and was referring to them, but was addressing various points at a much slower pace, and didn't have a prepared script that he read from the entire time. So that was just the difference between the two of their approaches. And then in following Miss Murphy's evidence, I will admit it was quite difficult by comparison to Mr. Grehan. People might be wondering why I have full quotes from Brendan Grehan and I have partial quotes from Miss Murphy. That's because Miss Murphy just simply spoke a lot faster. So as a result of that, just trying to keep up with her and to get the highlights of what she said, just to explain that.
That's interesting, because that reminds me of listening to the audio tapes. I found it almost impossible to transcribe the audio tapes, because when we normally cover court cases, it's effectively either a judge talking or two people having one person asking questions, the other a witness answering questions, barrister and witness, and it is a much slower pace. So when Dowdall and Mr. Hutch were talking on the tapes, it was quite fast because it was a normal conversation. So that's interesting that you found that difficult there as well.
Yes, and so when live tweeting this, it was just important that I was able to tweet accurately. So not necessarily, I didn't pick up every single sentence she said, but I got the essence of what she said. So look, I don't propose to go through this in absolute forensic detail because people know the basic facts of the case in terms of the CCTV footage showing the vehicles and the movements of the vehicles and the timing. So she did it in chronological order in terms of the evidence against all three men from the beginnings of things on the 4th of February into the 5th of February, and then the movements of the vehicles driven by Paul Murphy and by Jason Bonney allegedly right up to the St. Vincent's GAA car park and the times in which they're seen there, etc. What I thought was interesting is that she has, for the first time, definitively said that the person on the CCTV footage getting into the BMW X5 that the state says was driven by Bonnie was Kevin Murray, was flat cap Kevin Murray. So we heard it was a flat capped individual. She says it's the state's position that it was Kevin Murray that got into this vehicle, and then she kind of went through all the movements of those vehicles in and out of St. Vincent's GAA. In relation to Paul Murphy, right? Paul Murphy is on, I'm doing my best to highlight this. Maybe at the end of this podcast, maybe the end of the week, we can go into a bit more detail about these two lads, because there's more to be heard about them. But to sum up, right, Paul Murphy is on CCTV at various different points, and he doesn't dispute the fact that he has been picked up on CCTV and even identified himself in it. So she was effectively arguing he's there on the tapes, you can see him, and his vehicle goes straight up to the Vincent's GAA and is seen picking up and is part of the convoy involved. And his argument that his taxi could have been cloned, she says, doesn't hold water because he has identified himself on CCTV. So it's basically saying here he is with the taxi right up to a crucial point. So his argument doesn't really hold up, she says. Jason Bonney then, I'll come back to this in further detail, but basically she says his alibi witnesses don't hold water, that there is evidence there to the contrary. This allegation that his father was driving the vehicle instead of him, she said, doesn't add up, that there are witnesses which have said that Mr. Bonney's father was home all day having lunch, and there was a witness which I'll come back to corroborate that. So he's on CCTV seen leaving his house, and his BMW goes into the Buckingham Village area where all these vehicles meet up, as does Paul Murphy's vehicle, and they go to the St. Vincent's GAA. So I'm summing that up as quickly as I can there in relation to those men. When it comes to Mr. Hutch, it's two things, two pillars in this investigation, which we've talked about at length, which is the tapes and then the evidence of Jonathan Dowdall. Okay, so she first spoke to the admission that was allegedly made by Gerry Hutch. She actually said the 7th of March, then corrected herself further down and said the 7th of February. So she talked about the Sunday World picture and the fact that it was a pixelated picture. She explained that perhaps Jonathan Dowdall, there was a conflation of memory in relation to that, because if you remember, he was challenged on the witness stand that he had recognised the person in the Sunday World photo, the man in drag, as being Patrick Hutch. And it was put to him that how can you recognise it as Patrick Hutch when the photo was pixelated in the Sunday World? Well, she explained that within a couple of weeks there was an unpixelated photograph, and so perhaps he's conflating his memory in relation to that. She said this is a time when tensions were heightened, and she said there was independent evidence from Con O'Callaghan from 3 Hutchins in Ireland that there were cell sites in the area, and that Dowdall's phone pinged off a cell mast at 15:16 on the 7th of February, within the weekend anyway, where he says that he met Gerry Hutch and this confession happened. She said the court had heard evidence as to why other cell masts in the area might have been busy, so this particular cell tower would have picked it up. So she said that there was effectively an admission right from the mouth of Gerry Hutch, but it wasn't the only admission from Gerry Hutch, and she pointed to the audio, and she came back to that later on. She said, look, if it was the case, as the defence put it, that Jonathan Dowdall was a quote-unquote careful schemer, that maybe it would have been easier for him to to lie about when this confession happened and say that it happened on the 20th of February, for example, because if you remember, there were NSU photographs of Gerry Hutch and Dowdall up in Donegal, Shane Rowan's home, on the 20th of February, and this was actually not the day of the secret recording. So she's saying it would have been easier for Dowdall to claim that the confession happened there, knowing what he knew from the book of evidence, yet he, it speaks to his credibility. She's saying that this allegation is something on a different date, and it's corroborated by this phone evidence.
So in other words, she's saying he could have made it up on the 20th.
Yes.
He could have, yeah, okay.
And it would have been easier for him to do that, she said. She said, look, he served a hefty sentence in prison for the torture of Alexander Healy. She called it I'm paraphrasing now, but she said it was a horrific, very serious, disgusting offence. And look, he is also a man that admittedly told lies in the past. She was making no bones about the fact that Dowdall is an admitted liar in the past. And she said, look, these are all things that wouldn't necessarily endear you to him as a person, but that doesn't mean that he isn't telling the truth about the confession in Whitehall.
Can I ask, Paul, before you go on, sorry, I know that Brendan, and we will come to this, that Brendan Grehan spoke about the yokes. Did Miss Murphy speak about the yokes?
Yes, the yokes, which she said are the AK-47s, and I'll come to that. Sorry, I'm probably getting ahead of myself, but in terms of the AK-47s, that is where all of the incriminating language is in relation to Gerry Hutch and things that he says about the movements of those weapons. I'll come back to that, sorry, in a moment, Mick. Just, I want to refer to... Yes, the cross-examination of Jonathan Dowdall, she mentions that was done expertly by Brendan Grehan, and that he was ashamed and embarrassed on the witness stand. But again, she's saying that doesn't take away from the audio tape or from the independent evidence which corroborates the movements and the allegations that Dowdall is making. So, for example, the Richmond Road meetup, right? He's saying that Gerry Hutch met him on the Richmond Road, and his father handed over the hotel keys on the 4th of February. And there's phone evidence in relation to that shows they were in the Richmond Road area at the time, he says. So there is corroborating evidence independent of Dowdall and some of the things that happened on the witness stand over those dramatic 7 days, she's basically arguing. So look, she's coming to what you're asking me about now on the audio. She's saying, look, there's a whole conversation between Gerry Hutch and Jonathan Dowdall on this tape about the 3 yokes, the AK-47 rifles, and throughout this, she's saying that it appears that Gerry Hutch is the man in charge, and that he is the one in control of the situation, and is talking about giving these yokes as a gift to the lads up north, and about throwing them up north, I think is the quote from Gerry Hutch. And she is making the argument that he is the one in charge, he is the one directing that this happens at a crucial point in time, just after the Regency Hotel incident had happened, and 2 days before the weapons were found to be in transit and Shane Rowan was caught with them. So she's saying all of that is crucial, in that Gerry Hutch had knowledge of this, was talking about moving them at a time when they were in transit, and that's hugely significant. She's also saying that throughout this conversation about talking about the Regency, there's no denials from Gerry Hutch and no point where he pushes back or denies involvement when Dowdall says things like, you never said it was used at the Regency and stuff like that. So she said, look, it's clear that the yokes were thrown up as a present. They were a gift. The gift that it was Gerry Hutch's gift to give. There was also something about a massive statement, if you can remember in the tapes, a massive statement that Gerry Hutch said that the use of the yokes in the Regency Hotel was a quote-unquote massive statement. Again, she's pointing to that being not a form of admission, but a guilty statement, and again, no denials from him here. And we came to the crucial point where Dowdall says, you never admitted to them that was anything to do with yous. And Hutch says, yeah, he knows, yeah. And according to the prosecution, according to Miss Murphy, she says that is clearly an admission by Gerry Hutch. to the murder of David Byrne. I could go on and on, but basically she got to a juncture which shocked us, where she said that the prosecution is alleging that Mr. Hutch was one of the two tactical gunmen that personally shot David Byrne. So if you remember when the Regency shooting happened, David Byrne, he was first shot by I think Tactical 1, and then subsequently shot by Tactical 2, who got up onto the desk, looked down at him and fired effectively the fatal shots.
It was, yeah, I mean, I know I watched the video in the previous trial of Patrick Hutch. I'm sure you did as well. It was extremely callous. And I seem to remember that Mr. Byrne, he essentially escaped, like with everybody else, but then he ran back. I think he was looking to trying to protect one of his friends, maybe in Daniel, I don't know, but he went back into the danger zone, and that's when he was shot by one man, and he was lying badly injured, and then someone got up and, rather coldly dispatched him, essentially. Yes, that was significant.
So it's shocking that she's saying it's the prosecution's case that he was one of those two gunmen that shot David Byrne. It's even closer to the bone than the previous allegation that he was one of the six. So he's one of the two tactical that shot him. And then in closing up her evidence, she said, look, there's maybe you remember this, Mick, there is a point on the audio where Hutch and Dowdall are talking about something else, in which they, where you might hold up a building, and Hutch says something about, well, he'd hold up a building for 5 minutes and give it and get out. And she says, in context of that, well, that's exactly what happened. Gerry Hutch held up a building, came out and gave it. And here he is on the tapes arranging for the onward transport of the items that he used, the guns. And she said that all of that in tandem shows beyond a reasonable doubt that Gerry Hutch is guilty of murder.
So she paints, so she essentially, like all closing statements by prosecution counsel, she brought all the strands that she believed were relevant to her case. She brought to the state case. She brought them all together and wrapped them up in a bow and presented them to the judge for consideration.
Yeah, and I mean, look, it was compelling towards the end when she wrapped all of that up in a tight, neat bow, in terms of when you take all of this evidence together, it shows, as she says, beyond a reasonable doubt that Mr. Hutch is guilty. Now, that's, when I say compelling, I mean, it's just obviously compelling to hear that. That's not me giving an opinion as to whether I believe that evidence or I think any which way or the other. I'm just saying it was very interesting to hear the prosecution come to the point where they're saying they were describing in more than one sentence the reasons why they believe Gerry Hutch is guilty.
And closing statements are all important for that very nature, because, the prosecution case is about building bricks, and you try and present, you put your best foot forward, like the defence, but I know we'll talk about Mr. Grehan in a minute. You put your best foot forward and you try to persuade, and you bring everything together, and as I say, you present it to the judge. So that's essentially what happened.
So I thought we might be done then, but we went for a lunch break, and we were told then that Brendan Grehan would give his closing speech in the afternoon. So we made a lot of progress in today, and that was very dramatic evidence indeed.
Okay, so that was Miss Murphy for the prosecution, and next up was Brendan Grehan Senior Counsel, who is Gerry Hutch's defence lawyer.
Yes, and as we're well versed in now by this stage, Brendan Grehan is a very dramatic orator. Everything he says, every kind of second sentence is a headline. Really, it's a dream for a headline writer, anyway, in terms of the content that he says. So his evidence, as I said, he just gives it, and it makes no difference in terms of when the judges sit down. They're going to look at the facts of the case. It makes a difference, I suppose, in terms of maybe finding him compelling, but I'm just describing the difference, I suppose, in the two of them. Miss Murphy read out her statement and was quite matter of fact. Mr. Grehan is, just generally speaking, from someone sitting in the courtroom, quite an interesting person to listen to. He speaks he's quite dramatic and a little bit slower pace, and that's what it was easier for me to follow and to live tweet for sure. So I don't really know where to begin, to be honest with you. Like, this was extraordinary evidence.
He is very good, that must be said. I mean, I could watch these barristers all day. It's just really, and we'll talk about the arguments and all they put forward. But it is. I mean, I would urge anybody the next time any big trial is going, just to go in and see the performance of these barristers. It really is another level.
Oh, it's something else. Well, anyway, he began by immediately challenging what Miss Murphy had just said. Look, she's stating, prosecution is stating that Mr. Hutch confesses on this tape. And one of the first things that Mr. Grehan says is, I challenge anyone to find any unambiguous admission in the audio. And he came back to that later on, in that he was making the case that there is no ambiguous, struggle with that word, obvious admission from Gerry Hutch on the tapes whatsoever. And even this, he knows, statement he's arguing isn't really an admission, and is taken out of context in terms of, he says the judges need to listen to the tapes as a whole, and not to, the court needs to take the tapes as a whole, and not to just cherry pick specific elements of the tapes in isolation. So that a very compelling argument right from the beginning. And then in terms of the firearms, so Mr. Grehan talks about how Miss Murphy talked about how Gerry Hutch appeared to be in control of the firearms and the movement of the firearms at a time that was crucial, just following the Regency Hotel incident. And he basically said, well, that's not really the case. This was at the very least over a month after the Regency at best had taken place, so it wasn't like this was immediately the same day or day after. In terms of that, then, this is what I think is really interesting. You probably found this interesting even just reading this, Mick, that Mr. Grehan said that while he's not, I'm trying to phrase this correctly, he's not making any admissions on behalf of his client in terms of guilt, in terms of any other offence, but he did say that there's a possibility that there is incriminating stuff said by Gerry Hutch on these tapes in relation to the firearms. But the way he said, again, this is where he speaks in headlines, he said, newsflash, Mr. Hutch is not charged with any firearms offences. He's charged with murder. And
that is a real biggie for a couple of reasons. Let's go back to the Patrick Hutch trial. Patrick Hutch, who the case against him was dropped, was an Alibi prosecuting, and we've been through that. He was charged with murder. He was also charged with possessing the Kalashnikovs used in the killing. Gerry Hutch is charged with murder. He's not charged with anything else. And if you think back to some of the questions that listeners asked us about, could the court find him not guilty of murder but guilty of something else? And I got legal advice on this, and it's no. The issue paper or the charge paper says murder, and that's it. So there's nothing else. So shin A, really. So it's very clever from Mr. Grehan. I think I'm just reading some of the notes there. He said the court may find about the firearms, but as you say, he's not charged with firearms.
Yes, and that's important to state that. He then spoke to Miss Murphy's allegation in her statement that Gerry Hutch was one of the tactical gunmen in the Regency Hotel. And he says, where could she possibly be getting this from? Where does that come from? And he says the only place that could come from is from Jonathan Dowdall and his word. And he spent quite a bit of time on Jonathan Dowdall, and he says that the prosecution's case ultimately stands or falls on Jonathan Dowdall's evidence. The accused, Gerry Hutch, he says, is presumed innocent and shouldn't have to, make a case as to anything. It's up to the prosecution to prove their case. It's important that he stated that, because I think people might have the question, why didn't Gerry Hutch take the stand or give evidence about his whereabouts on that day? Well, Mr. Grehan spoke to that and basically said that it isn't up to Mr. Hutch to prove anything. It's up to the state to prove their case.
And it's a high bar. Remember, it's not the balance of probabilities in a civil case. It's beyond reasonable doubt. So in any, and I'll just speak generally about this, in any defence case, and anybody is being defended, it's up to the prosecution to prove. The defence don't have to prove anything, and the prosecution have to prove that nobody would have a doubt beyond reasonable doubt.
Yes, and just I'm going to get through as much of this as I can. Sorry. he put it that it was the shining jewel, the prosecution's shining jewel in the case is if it is the audio. He made the point, well, the cops, the Gardaí had this audio of Gerry Hutch and Jonathan Dowdall since March of 2016. Why then did it take until 2021 for a European arrest warrant to be issued for Gerry Hutch if there is crystal clear admissions on this to murder on this tape, as the state is claiming? If there are admissions on this tape, well, why did it take so long for there to be a arrest warrant for Mr. Hutch? I could go on about what he says about Dowdall for some time, but he called him a liar and a proven liar, and went through multiple various examples to basically state that. And then he says that effectively what Miss Murphy did in her closing argument was try to marry the evidence of Jonathan Dowdall with the audio. And he's saying that these are two bad halves and they don't make a whole when you put them together. And I think at the end of his speech ultimately said something similar, that they're trying to marry two horses and they're falling in between. The state is trying to cement two different things together to make their case, and neither of them hold water, is basically his argument.
I was just going to say, look, headline writers are going to have a field day tomorrow, I imagine, with reference to a cartoon character.
Yes, so that's interesting because, look, yeah, he called Dowdall a liar and a perjurer, and then compared him to, he just said a certain cartoon character who says, I didn't do it. God, I don't want to get this wrong now. I should be a fan. I can't get the full quote, but he compared him to Bart Simpson in terms of his lies.
People saying it wasn't me and I didn't do it. That sounds like so many journalists I know. Probably myself as well.
Yeah, so he said Dowdall is a tainted witness. He was not a neutral witness. He himself was charged with the murder of David Byrne. He was just finishing a lengthy sentence himself when he was charged with murder, and he was facing the real prospect of not getting bail. Then went in on detail about how ultimately it came to the point where the Gardaí didn't object to Jonathan Dowdall getting bail in relation to his murder charge, and he was insinuating that at that point there was a deal being made and the guards were facilitating an interview with him, and that's why they didn't object to bail. He said that was something that was frankly unheard of, and clearly no matter whether somebody tries to say that there was no sweet deal happening, Jonathan Dowdall thought in his mind that he was getting a deal, and that he, in exchange for dropping the murder charge, would give evidence in this case, and that has to be taken into consideration as well, he's saying.
And sorry, just to say one more thing, we still, even at this stage, we still, as far as I'm aware, we still don't know if Mr. Dowdall has been admitted into the witness security programme. He's being assessed for it, but there's no finality about if he's got it. He probably will, but just from what we understand at this stage, he hasn't been admitted to that programme.
You know, it was said in court today that he has not been admitted to the programme. The word yet wasn't said after that, so I don't know whether there's been some development since we last. It actually was just said that him and his family have not been admitted to the witness protection programme. Maybe that was missing the word yet. But anyway.
Sorry, did Miss Murphy say that, Paul?
Miss Murphy said that, yeah.
Oh, that's interesting. Maybe that is... it could be just a missing word.
I don't want
significant.
She didn't say yes. Yeah, she didn't say yes. That's all I can say. We spent a bit of time then with Mr. Grehan on the booking of the room and Patrick Dowdall and all of that, and he was arguing, why didn't they go into the main car park? Perhaps that's because Jonathan Dowdall didn't want to get picked up by CCTV. And he says that Jonathan Dowdall repeatedly said that his father could corroborate his story about the hotel keys being given to Gerry Hutch, yet Patrick Dowdall was never called, and he asks why is that, and says could that be that because Patrick Dowdall, there'll be a lot of questions for him, a lot of difficult questions for him, and he said that while Jonathan Dowdall kept insisting that his father could corroborate and back up his story, he said actions speak louder than words, and that's not what transpired in this case. So he spoke to that, and he also said that in relation to the transaction, the buying of the room, he said he called it a bogey transaction, and why did it take 6 people to book a hotel room? Why was Patrick Dowdall, Patsy Hutch, Patricia Dowdall and Patricia Dowdall's father and all of these people involved in this process of booking a hotel room? And he was saying that things don't add up, and it's a very unusual thing, and we haven't maybe gotten to the bottom of that.
Sorry, just Paul, can I just ask quickly? You said that Mr. Grehan spoke for about 2 hours, and Miss Murphy spoke for about 1 hour.
Yes.
Obviously, he had an awful lot to say. Did he keep you raptured, shall we say? Did he, were you into what he was saying?
Yeah, and I don't want to keep you for 2 hours, but it was fascinating the whole way through. He didn't really know where he was going to go next. He didn't necessarily keep to like Miss Murphy's statement was quite structured, and she went in chronological order in terms of the events, whereas Mr. Grehan, I don't want to say he was all over the place, but he was not speaking in any necessary structure, obvious order. So you didn't know what was coming next, so he was paying attention to literally every word that he said. He talked a bit about the Richmond Road meeting and how Jonathan Dowdall, upon cooperating upon being charged with murder, would have had access to the book of evidence and known about Sarah Skedd's evidence and the mobile phone data, and was implicating that that's why he was talking about Richmond Road being the spot where this happened, because he knew that himself and his father's phone had pinged off an area in the Richmond Road on that day, so that would help corroborate his story. So again, he said that had to be taken into consideration, that Dowdall had access to the book of evidence and would have known that information was there. Oh yeah, sorry. Well, first we'll talk about the park meeting, right? The central allegation by Jonathan Dowdall, the meet-up in the park in Whitehall. Mr. Grehan spoke to the fact that Jonathan Dowdall's story on this evolved over time, but one thing that he appeared to be clear on throughout is that this meeting with Hutch happened at around 11:30, that it happened in the morning, and he says basically effectively that neither on the 7th nor the 8th is there any evidence to support that Jonathan Dowdall met Gerry Hutch in the morning. And he says that the state is now trying to turn around and say that this missing 3 hours where his phone isn't pinging off anything, that could have been the time when he met Gerry Hutch. But he says there was never any suggestion that he was with Gerry Hutch in a park in Whitehall for 3 hours, and there was never any suggestion at all in the case up until now, neither from Jonathan Dowdall nor anyone else, that his phone was off or anything like that, and it was never said by the witness.
So if memory serves me, he initially said his evidence was that he met Gerry Hutch on the 8th, because we remember the 8th of February, because that's the day that Mr. Hutch's brother Eddie, or Neddy, was murdered. So it was a memorable day, but I think under maybe cross-examination, whenever he conceded it may have, or he said it may have been the 7th, the day before, which was a Sunday. Yes,
we could go over that again, but yes, that is exactly the case. But so it was then a possibility that he had gotten the day wrong, perhaps, as the prosecution were saying, and that it happened at this time at 3:15 in the afternoon on the 7th rather than on the 8th, as he had been saying. But Mr. Grehan said that Dowdall's story was repeatedly that it happened in the morning, and there's nothing to support that. Then, in relation to the audio, again, this is another point that Mr. Grehan brought up, in that, isn't it extraordinary, he says, that there was this confession in the park from Gerry Hutch to Jonathan Dowdall, and yet in a 10-hour conversation it never came up once. And he says, we know that Mr. Dowdall can't keep his mouth shut, and yet it never comes up.
Jonathan Dowdall did ask an awful lot of questions on the tapes. You can see, I'm not saying he's trying to wheedle information out of him, but he's having a conversation with Gerry Hutch and starting conversations. So yeah, I mean, it was 10 hours. He's right.
And then Jonathan Dowdall had said on the stand that Gerry Hutch in the tapes is lying to him, and that is what's happening on these tapes. But he's saying, Mr. Grehan saying, well, why would Mr. Hutch lie to him in an unguarded conversation, and especially in light of the fact that he had only recently allegedly confessed to murder to him? Why would he now suddenly be lying to him? And he said it just makes absolutely no sense. So he just says the suggestion that Gerry Hutch had confessed to him is highly unlikely in the extreme, and he points to the fact that Jonathan Dowdall, based off his own evidence, had said that he barely knew Gerry Hutch. He would have known him to see through boxing club. He knew Patsy Hutch much better, but why would Gerry Hutch confide in a person that Dowdall admits he barely knew? So yeah, then we come on to he called Dowdall a proven liar, an admitted liar, and a perjurer. This is where the Bart Simpson reference came in. He admitted to lying to a previous bench of the Special Criminal Court when he was charged with the torture and waterboarding of Alex Healy, and he said, Mr. Grehan said that Dowdall lied to this court as well. So he's been caught lying multiple times. He was a proven liar in terms of when he went on Joe Duffy's live line and said that he wasn't a criminal and he didn't know why his home was being searched, and Mr. Grehan said that is evidence that he's a persuasive, convincing, confident and practiced liar. Throughout the trial, he said that said things like, "I'm not telling the truth, but I'm not telling lies." And Mr. Grehan again said he look, throughout this whole process, he told all manner of lies, big lies, little lies, anything, if he thinks he can get away with it.
So he hammered him, really? He really hammered him.
He really hammered him. And he said there's too many lies to go through. It would actually take days to go through them all. In relation to the explanation of tablets, Dowdall said that he was on tablets when he was on Liveline and when he was in the car with Hutch. Mr. Grehan said he'd never come across anything like that before. That's where the quote is. In effect, he was a bit like a cartoon character who says, "I didn't do it, nobody saw me do it, you can't prove anything." Well, that's a famous Bart Simpson quote. So that's where that came in. He says that Dowdall was an evasive witness, impossible to tie down, and the court heard how he answered questions by going on long monologues or avoiding answering the question altogether. At that point, he took a break, and when we came back then, he said that in the tapes we've got Dowdall talking about planting bombs, lining up bombs, assassinations, kidnapping people, and all the rest of it. And he ultimately concluded that, if anything, Dowdall was worried about these tapes. Dowdall was the person who would be worried about these tapes coming out rather than Gerry Hutch, because he's the one that says all of these incriminating things that he dismissed away in court and said were not real. He says he pointed to the fact that he thought it was ridiculous that Dowdall explained that he knew about waterboarding and bomb making from the television. He said that that's not exactly family friendly TV, and even if you were looking at certain programs where you might learn that, it's extraordinary that you then try and act out what you've supposedly learned from the TV without killing somebody.
So Paul, it 2 hours is an awful long time, and he clearly got, Mr. Grehan clearly got landed an awful lot of punches. But I'd be interested in, how did he end his speech?
Well, he ended his speech by saying, look, there's quite simply no ironclad admissions from Gerry Hutch at all in these confessions. And, Jonathan Dowdall is a proven liar, and nothing that he said can necessarily be taken in tandem. He said that the prosecution have sought to ride two horses in this matter and in effect marry them off at the end of the case. But they've fallen down in between. He's basically said that the prosecution haven't made out the case where you could be satisfied about the guilt of Gerry Hutch. Towards the end there, he also brought up, that yes, perhaps there is, although he makes no concessions, there is talk of criminality in relation to firearms. But again, it pointed out that there's nothing there to suggest that he's guilty of the offence of murder, and that's the only offence before the court. And I thought this was also interesting. He said that there is no evidence that Gerry Hutch was even in the country on the 5th of February. There's no evidence before the court, that is, that Gerry Hutch was in the country on the 5th of February, let alone in the Regency, save for Jonathan Dowdall's word. Now, that falls in line with, Gerry Hutch hasn't actually had to answer that question. And he has, Mr. Grehan, the way he's explained that is that it is up to the state to prove their case, not for Gerry Hutch to prove anything, and he hasn't taken the witness stand. So I just thought that was a compelling statement that Mr. Grehan said out loud, that there's no evidence that his client Gerry Hutch was even in the country, let alone in the Regency, apart from Jonathan Dowdall's word. And he went on at length tearing apart Jonathan Dowdall's word and his reliability throughout those 2 hours.
So there was no messing from either of the senior counsel today? They really went for it, the pair of them.
No, they really went for it, and I'm going to say that phrase, but it will be up to the judges now to decipher that and to look at that in great detail. But it's a compelling case, hugely compelling.
So what happens tomorrow? You would think that tomorrow would probably be the last day of the case?
Yeah, it's looking like tomorrow will be the final day, and we're just 12 weeks in. As they said, the trial was going to be 12 weeks in length. So we have Bernard Condon and John Fitzgerald representing Jason Bonney and Paul Murphy, and they will give their closing speeches tomorrow, and that will end the case, and then the judges will go off and deliberate and come back with their judgment, I presume, in a number of months' time.
And it's possible that Miss Justice Tara Burns, the presiding judge, might give an approximate date as to when that judgment will come back.
Yes, hopefully. Do we want to talk briefly about what was heard in the morning? Or
I think we should, just very briefly, just for context, because I think it is important. This was about the evidence. It's about the alibi evidence for Jason Bonney, in essence.
I think we might come back over this in more detail tomorrow in relation to Jason Bonney, but just to briefly tell people that this morning was also very interesting in that, if you might recall, the previous day there was a witness for Jason Bonney that kind of halted matters, and this was the individual Peter Tyrrell, who said that he'd seen Jason Bonney's father driving the BMW X5. This would have been roughly about 5 minutes after the hit team were supposed to have escaped, and this BMW was used to help them escape, and he saw this Jeep being driven by Jason Bonney's father, which corroborates Jason Bonney's claim that it was his father driving the vehicle and not him. But the shocker today was that the prosecution called a witness, Mr. Paul Byrne, who is the brother-in-law of Jason Bonney, and Mr. Byrne states that he spent the day, the 5th of February, with Willie Bonney, Jason Bonney's father. And his explanation for that, without getting into great detail about it, was he can remember because he went on a holiday to Gran Canaria. They came back on the night of the 4th, and as is normal on a Friday, they would go over to Willie and Greta Bonney's house and have lunch with them and spend a couple of hours with them. And he can distinctly remember, he says, going to Willie Bonney's house and having the lunch with them and spending a number of hours with them between midday and about 4 or half 4 on the 5th of February. And that Willie Bonney, he says, never left the house. And he also says Willie Bonney never drove the BMW X5. He always knew him to drive a Lexus, a black Lexus Jeep. And so look, that directly contradicts the alibi evidence of Mr. Bonney, in that there's a claim here that Willie Bonney, who is now dead, so can't defend himself, spent the entire day in his home and not driving a car, being part of a hit team, helping a hit team to escape, rather. Sorry. So
that's really interesting. And, you know, seeing things like this, I always sit there and go, how could you be a judge? How could you differentiate between the two and decide? Because, you know, the people have gone in and have sworn evidence. So I wouldn't be a judge having to decide that, I have to say.
Well, I mean, this witness was pretty crystal clear in that he can remember this day. He says you remember things like he can remember where he was on the day of 9/11. Well, he can remember where he was on the 5th of February. He remembers hearing about the Regency Hotel incident on the news, and that he was in Willie Bonney's house at the time. I mean, that's very interesting. But
also, you know, for balance, Miss McGlynn, one of the alibi witnesses, says she remembers the day because it was her young child's birthday.
Yes, she said it was her child's birthday, and she claims that Willie Bonney was in her house. She saw him getting into the BMW X5 after leaving her house, and she saw Jason Bonney going across the road to the building site. And she says she saw Jason Bonney at a time when, if the state's case is to be believed, he should have been over at the Vincent's GAA club. So it's interesting to see where that'll go. We'll get more on that tomorrow when it comes to the closing speeches for those two men. But we have come to the end of the trial in relation to Gerry Hutch. So a huge day today. I didn't even touch on, I'd say 50%, but I gave you the highlights there. And maybe when we do finish up this podcast for the week, we'll try to give you anything that we did miss. But thanks again for listening.
Thanks very much, Paul, and thanks to listeners. Great stuff.